Well, hi there, Mr. Thompson here with a science video lesson, finishing off my series on evolution and covering evidence for evolution. So how do we know that evolution is a thing? What gives us, reason to believe that evolution actually happened? All right, so in specifics, we're going to talk about plate tectonics, fossils, anatomy, embryology, and DNA, and how those things give us evidence for evolution and convince us that evolution may have actually happened. All right, so plate tectonics, how does that come into play? Well, we know that plate tectonics is the movement of the Earth's crust, right? Basically the continents and the plates that make up the crust of the Earth moving around for all kinds of reasons. Not going to get into that, how that happens or why that happens or whatever, but ultimately, if we trace that back in time, we get one supercontinent, right? The continent that we believe was originally the one single continent that existed at one time, and the continental drift, right, and the forces in the Earth from underneath caused that continent to break apart. Well, if we consider what we've been looking at with evolution, things like divergent evolution and groups of organisms being separated, that's what's going on here. So we have in this image, the way that we believe the continents sort of fit together. And this is one of these things that's sort of, it's evidence for plate tectonics and it's evidence for evolution sort of simultaneously. What we have is some fossils that some fossils that, as we can see, the colored areas are the fossils that would have existed in that one supercontinent. And as the continents spread apart, obviously those groups of organisms were separated and they evolved differently, right? But the fossils that are found on those different continents, we can see where they sort of lined up and where there's similar fossils found on the different continents. Okay, so that tells us that putting together with plate tectonics that there was this divergent evolution that happened from the species that lived, on this one supercontinent, way back when. All right, so that's plate tectonics, the argument from plate tectonics. More on fossils. So fossils themselves are evidence for evolution. So fossils are parts of an organism that were preserved, right? So what happens is when an animal dies, or may die from being covered by Earth, it may have died in a landslide or something like that, or maybe it died somewhere else and a landslide happened to happen on it or something like that, or it fell into some sort of pit or something like that, and it gets preserved, right? So it can be the bones or teeth. It's usually hard, bony parts of an animal, claws and things like that. But it can also be evidence of that organism. So a footprint could be stuff like fecal matter or whatever, all kinds of different things that we can see that were caused by an organism, and they get preserved in the soil, right? Lots of layers of soil. When we sort of look at the the Earth's crust, we can see where it's broken apart, and we can see layers, and different fossils get left in different areas. Okay, fossils are very rare, but they can do a few things for us. They can provide for us the transitional forms. So this is one of the big things. We can see that there was different species around, previously, and we can see what organisms, different species led to the evolution of what we have today. Fossils can be dated by comparing other fossils around and by looking at those different layers, and they can also be carbon dated as well. Okay. This is the explanation of transitional forms. Evolutionary intermediate species, right? Those transitional forms. All right, sorry, I forgot to hit the play button there. All right, anatomy. How does anatomy play into the evidence for evolution? Basically, I'm just going to cover one little element of this. It's called homologous structures. So homologous structures are similar features, similar anatomical features in different species that evolved from a feature in a common ancestor. Okay, so one animal had a certain feature, that, one organism, that species evolved into different species, and that feature evolved with it, right, and changed. But we can see how that feature in the different species is related to the one that was in the common ancestor. An example of this is forelimbs. So like forelimbs, arms, and hands and things like that. So in bats, whales, cats, horses, and humans, okay? And we can see in this image, we've got one of each of those, and we can look at those and examine them and see how they're similar. The bones have similar structure, and all kinds of different similarities amongst those features, and see how they evolved from a single forearm in some ancestral species, right? So that's one example of anatomy being evidence for evolution. Embryology. So embryology is looking at embryos, right? Embryos are preborn organisms, right? So developing in the womb of the mother, right? And we can see similarities in how embryos develop in different species. Okay, and the features of organisms in the embryos, right? So one example of this is ears, okay? And in human embryos and fish embryos, at a certain stage, they have almost the exact same little slit that in part of their ears that will, in humans, will become a little bone, okay? It'll form as a little bone that's in our ear, in the inner ear. And in fish, it turns into gills, right? So that slit that's in the embryo is an indication that there is a common ancestor between humans and fish. All right. The last thing, and this is just a quick one, is DNA. And even though this is a really quick example and a quick part of the evidence for evolution, it's actually a huge one. It's a really, really big deal. And if you read modern recent books about evolution and why we believe evolution is true, DNA is going to be your number one sort of example that they will spend tons and tons of time on. But I'm just going to give you a really simple breakdown of it. It's just the gene sequences. So we know that features and characteristics of organisms come from these sequences of genes, right, in the DNA. And basically the similarities in those gene sequences are an indication of relatedness evolutionarily, right? So common ancestry and that kind of thing. So that's a real brief overview. You could take any one of these and really dive into it to try to understand it and understand why it gives evidence for evolution happening. But those are your basic categories. So thanks for watching. Catch you next time.